All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And exciting episode is an understatement for today. We've got a returning guest. We're talking with Simon Kuestenmacher, who talks to us about the demographics of interest rates and also talks to us about AI. Is it something we need to fear or is it something we need to embrace? What else do we cover, Ben?
Mate, we're going to bend people's mind into the future, Bryson, with one interesting statement. Intergenerational wealth transfer.
Love it.
You need to understand what that means, so hang around for the show.
And it's going to answer a very fundamental question about can property prices go up in the future? So, folks, it is a ripper show. Let's get into it now.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. And hello, Ben. How are you, mate?
Oh, mate, big show. Like I'm good because I know what's about to come up. So it's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, we got a returning guest today, Simon Kuestenmacher. And if your hair isn't blown back at the end of this conversation, I don't know what it's going to take, Ben. If you love property and you love the idea of self-funding your retirement, and you love the idea of having a look over the horizon to see what is essentially a bunch of stats on a piece of paper that Simon can bring to life in story and what it means and trends, it's amazing. So you're right, we've got a lot to share with our community. So before we get there, Ben, I just have a favour for our long-term listeners. If they can help us grow our community, right? So I reckon that this podcast that they're about to hear is that insightful for them. You could share it with a friend and it would be insightful for them, even if they're not property investors. And It's just because it talks about millennials, it talks about baby boomers, you talk about, remember when we were living and there was 7 people in a house and what that looks like now. And there is just a lot of stuff about people that a lot of people would get benefit from. So we think it's a ripper. So if you could share it with as many people as you can, we would be grateful. So if we've added any value to you over the journey since we've been doing this, Ben, that's all we ask. If you just screenshot it from wherever you're listening right now and text it, WhatsApp it, Facebook it, whatever it takes just to share it with a friend, we would be grateful for that.
Agreed. I mean, it's just that, this whole debate about pessimism versus optimism.
Yeah.
Surely this should lean you into actually, you know what? This country is a great country. Yep. Aspiration should still be alive and well. There's a lot of great things that are going to happen with this nation, and we've just got to make it happen, right? We've got to be positive about that. So it's definitely a glass half full episode today.
Glass half full is a great way to describe it, Ben. I will absolutely lean in on that description. So, folks, in my Mindset Minute, I'm now no longer Morgan Houseling, Ben. That is a thing of the past. For the last 13 episodes with Winter Series in the break, in the middle there, it was fun. So maybe for our audience, it might be cheeky for them just to give him a little tweet or something just to say, hey, listen, loved hearing you on the Property Couch. Would love to get you on the Property Couch. And
Chase for Morgan.
Chase for Morgan. We will start that outreach very quickly. Let's hope it doesn't take 6 years like it did for Chris Voss. But hey, my Mindset Minute theme today is I came across this, Ben. You might be interested in this, but 7 disciplines to focus your energies on that you need to master, right?
Okay.
So I'll quickly riff through them. First one is foundational. So clearly the 3 R's that you learn at school: reading, writing, arithmetic. Then physical, how to sleep well, eat well, and move well. Professional, so your vocational stuff, right? And then we move into a couple of different layers. Emotional, so developing your EQ. Relational, so communication, influence, and dealing with others. 6 is very much in the lane of this podcast, which is financial, so personal finance and how to multiply it. And then 7 is philosophical. And the values that you tend to choose to live by. Now, I love being in this lane. I've spent a fair bit of time in this lane of late because what we do know is that we have all these mooring lines, Ben, and sometimes our self-beliefs can be limiting because outside of the story that we're telling in our own head, the circumstances might suggest that it's actually just a story in your head and it doesn't really exist anywhere else. So I know you are well and truly on this train. So with that in mind, those 7 disciplines are what I'm trying to spend my time mastering. I want to fill my mind with other successful people, particularly those who've walked the path that I'm treading or pursuing or sharing any. I therefore want to share any patterns that I observe with this TPC community. So, for example, we've done Dale Carnegie, we've done Morgan Housel, we've spoken about Dave Ramsey, Tim Ferriss, James Clear, and even this one will make you blush, Ben, but even stuff that you talk about is philosophical ideas that I take on board and look through a different lens as well. So I'm really lucky that I surround myself with a lot of virtual people, and I'm lucky to rub shoulders and spend a lot of time with you. So if I find someone who I resonate with and go deep, I just go sort of fanatical and deep and stay in that lane for a little while. And so Ramit Sethi is someone who I've spent a bit of time with. He spends time educating younger people on how to manage their money and has a very simple philosophy that's not too dissimilar to Mike Kemp, who we had on the podcast, where it's just get into that dollar cost averaging of just letting time do the work. You don't have to be a champion investor. You just got to be in it for the long term. So he recently featured in a Netflix documentary on how to get rich. I watched that. I enjoyed it. His book is an introduction to personal finance, but I first started hearing about him on the Tim Ferriss podcast. So that's the backdrop, right? So here's the message today. In his book, he made this observation: 80% of first-generation millionaires, i.e. meaning their parents weren't rich, collected their significant wealth by 3 things. 1 was controlling their spending, 2 was regular investing, and 3 was, in some cases, entrepreneurship, right? So, and entrepreneurship is basically turning ideas into successful businesses, right? Of which property investing is a small business, right?
It is.
So, on average, millionaires invest 20%. This is, again, still quoting Ramit, and it's American stats, all right? So let's just, the patterns and the observations is the point of today's Mindset Minute, right?
Yeah.
So millionaires invest 20% of their household income each year. Their wealth is not measured by how much they make each year, but by how much they've saved and invested over time. Investing is the single most effective way to get rich. So if we're looking for patterns, Ben, those 3 things seem to resonate beautifully with the philosophy of the property couch, because A, we're asking you to control your spending, i.e. Spend less than you earn. Imagine that as a concept. Number 2, we're asking for you to regularly invest, which is chipping away some of your income towards something other than the here and now, something towards the future. So regular investing, and then entrepreneurship. So how is our audience involved in entrepreneurship? Well, if you're buying an investment property, you are one of a small group of people in this country who are, but you are running a small business, and small business is all about entrepreneurship. So you're taking a risk, and you're trying to get a return from taking that risk. And for a lot of cases, you're not a greedy fat cat. You're actually just someone who's trying to use the tax system to your advantage so that you can actually self-fund whilst taking a lot of risk. And a lot of investors have actually seen over the last 12 months that investing in property isn't just rainbows and lollipops, because some of those property investors have had to disproportionately absorb increasing costs that they haven't passed on to their customer, i.e. the tenant. So I just thought we'd reflect on that today, Ben, in that if philosophy, and I know it's something that you focus on too, and it's something that I'm focusing on, here's a philosophy of someone who's out of our market, it's out of our sphere, but still offering the same message and the same core objectives. And to be honest, they're actually really boring. Control your spending, regularly invest, and involve yourself in a little bit of entrepreneurship. Like, it's not exactly, well, the entrepreneurship's fun, but the rest is pretty boring. So it is never not doing the basics well is the secret to success. So as we come off the back of Morgan Housel helping us get a better understanding of our spending, which is the hidden stuff behind closed doors that not a lot of people see, here we are just reminding ourselves on what some of the basics are for you to actually get some success, so that at some point in the future you can spend your money hopefully on things that matter to you, that the most to you.
And I think also one of the big things we do, and thank you for the compliment you paid, because I'll return it in spades, is iron sharpens iron. And so the reason why we always want to have dialogue around money management and investing is because the more you talk to people who are successful about it, and you think about the classic traits of what they're using, it isn't rocket science. It's just building these habits and executing on them. So, yeah, Bryce, I've taken a lot from obviously the conversations you and I have had. Also, we've got our silent mentors, the people that we haven't been able to talk to, plus obviously our group of people. And yes, we're in a business that spends all of its time doing this to help others. And so we're taking all of that rich knowledge and passing it on to our community. So my takeaway from what you've just said is they are the fundamentals, but also exchange in the dialogue to those people who are doing it well to build confidence. Because if you can't believe in what's true and what's available to you, you're never going to take action.
Well said, mate. Success is never not doing the basics well. So basically, continue to do them very, very well, and that really is the secret to success. So, all right, we've got a wonderful interview today with Simon. I'm going to give you a little hint, folks. At the end, Ben and I were super disappointed that our time was up. It flew. The conversation was rich. It was wonderful content. Let's cut to it now. All right, Ben, I'm very excited to have the conversation we're about to have today. We are chatting with Simon Kuestenmacher. He is a returning guest, and he's also a rising star globally in the field of data management and insight. He is the co-founder of the Demographics Group based in Melbourne, and he's also presented to numerous corporate and industry audiences across Australia and overseas on demographic trends, consumer insights, and cultural change in Australia. He is a columnist with the Australian and the New Daily newspapers. Simon is an engaging speaker who backs his opinion with data and evidence and a very distinct and appealing German accent. Simon, that is true. Welcome back to the Property Couch.
That's great to be back on.
That's good to have you. You co-hosted with me back in episode 353 when this guy was traveling through the north of Western Australia. So that was a really fun chat. But normally we have a conversation at the beginning with all of our guests about tell us your backstory around money. But given you're a returning guest, we have already covered that. So I just wanted to summarize a few things that we spoke about last time, Simon, just in case anything is updated since. But your parents were both authors. You said you have to be generous to receive generously. What you do in front of your kids is more important than what you say, which I thought was profound, and not much that you would change with more money, because to you, it is just security and stability. Is that still true, Simon?
That's very much true. So money is stability. Last time I talked about the 10x effect. What would you do if you had the same lifestyle, but you would get 10 times as much money? And I wouldn't change much. A couple of the screens I would look at would be more expensive. The chair would be more expensive, but the utility of what I do would be pretty much the same. So that's my approach towards money, and think of me as fiscally conservative. Stability, financial security, that is much more important than pure accumulation of wealth for me.
Well, with your German background and now you're Australian, you live in Australia, has anything sort of influenced you in the Australian way, or is it still just rock solid, the same as it ever was?
Well, you do get sucked into the whole housing narrative in Australia, where home ownership is absolutely crucial. Just the obsession about talking about housing on a such frequent basis, that is not the case in Europe. So that is one of the first observations that you make when you're in Australia. You go like, that topic is obviously important everywhere, but Aussies are much more interested in this. This is, well, you run a massive podcast on the topic. The newspapers are full of this stuff. These things are unthinkable in Germany. So that took a bit of change in pace here.
Well, I think that's a beautiful segue into some of the topics we want to talk about today around some of the different trends that you're seeing. And obviously, the biggest conversation at the moment is really around interest rates. And you've got an interesting way of looking at interest rates with your, demographier background. So talk to us about what are you seeing in regards to the demographics inside interest rates?
Yeah, so I'd always start with remembering, what does the RBA do? What is it there for? And the RBA has three mandates. The first one is guarantee the stability of the currency. That means keep the inflation between 2 and 3%. That's the first one. The second one is guarantee full employment. Full employment they define as an unemployment rate of 4.5%. That's the target. And the third one is the general stability or the general well-being of the Australian uh, population, the prosperity of the nation. The third one is so vague you can completely forget about it. So they want inflation 2 to 3%, unemployment 4.5%. The RBA now finds itself in an environment where they have an inflation rate that is higher than their target, and they have an unemployment rate that is much lower than their target. And so they go, no, wait a second, we have one tool as the RBA to fix all of this. We can move the cash rate, this interest rate number up and down. And so that's what they can do. The problem is that they fight an uphill battle against demographics. What they are doing is absolutely impossible at the moment, being in order to sort of increase the interest rates, arguing if we increase that rate, people stop spending, or they slow down their spending, which is deflationary, then inflation goes down. That's very good. Problem is, we're finding ourselves in a demographic environment over the whole next decade where we want to see the highest spending ever. You have the millennial cohort, the by far biggest generation, moving into the highest spending phase of the life cycle. That's the early family formation stage. Every penny you earn when you're in your 40s goes straight out the door, back into the economy, creates all this beautiful economic activity usually. And now that is not wanted by the RBA. Also, when people move into retirement, they're meant to, historically, they're meant to be poor pensioners who have to, really carefully watch every dollar that they're spending. That's not the case right now. The people that are retiring now are asset rich and cash rich baby boomers. Baby boomers and older, they make up a relatively small share of the population, but they hold well over 60% of all the cash savings in this country. High inflation is good for them. They will not stop spending whatsoever. Yes, theoretically, the RBA can amp up interest rates, and they've done it repeatedly. You amp up interest rates, eventually you'll stop spending. You'll make the society as a whole stop spending. But the people who stop spending, they are the let's call it the bottom quarter or thereabouts of society. These are also young people who have no cash savings whatsoever. So you create pain, if you will, at the wrong ends of the spectrum. And also, as soon as people get into trouble, particularly if you have a Labour government, they will spend big on those poor, suffering people, which is inflationary in nature. So you fight this uphill battle. That's difficult. Also, the RBA wants to increase unemployment. They want to create more unemployed people because they want full employment. Um, that's difficult for various reasons. First and foremost, there's a moral recoil that says, we want to have as many people in employment as possible. That it's a good thing. So you increase those interest rates, it makes it harder for businesses to operate. Eventually, some of those businesses will go bust. We need to fire people. You create more unemployment. But what is being served then? Well, you create, again, masses, not masses, but quite a few people that need to be subsidized by the state. And again, that is inflationary. Again, that drives up the need to actually increase interest rates rather further. And you only always create pain at the wrong end of the spectrum. This is brutal. My argument here is the RBA should leave the cash rate as is. They should actually send one tiny decline just to send a positive signal, because as long as the interest rate, as long as inflation moves in the right direction, it doesn't need to be in the 2 to 3% bracket. As long as it moves into the right direction, that's all it takes for now. And completely, as an RBA, forget about unemployment. We in Australia will benefit from painfully low unemployment because over the last 2 decades, Australia fell behind in every single innovation technology type ranking that you could imagine, simply because businesses only innovate under pressure. Australia, in a sense, had it too easy. We could just grow our wealth through a bit of a mining boom, through migration. Remember that migration, we needed to fix our demographic profile, but migration also always creates economic activities, and it fills all those gaps. And if you can't increase productivity, you just throw more labor at it. All those things are too difficult. A painfully low unemployment rate will help Australian businesses to invest big time into AI, into technology, to drive up worker productivity, which eventually will reflect in higher wages, which will make living more fun, more affordable. All of this stuff is a big shift, and I'm very happy that in recent times we had the RBA stabilize the cash rate. And I would, nobody says it, but I would like in the last meeting before Christmas, if there was if you lower the cash rate, I think this would be a very positive signal to the country. You then leave it cruising at this tiny bit lower altitude for a bit longer. But that's just my Christmas wish list, so to speak.
It's a nice Christmas list. I'm sure every mortgage holder would love that idea, and every baby boomer doesn't like that idea because, obviously, to your point earlier, they're getting a lot of return on their interest, for their savings in bank. So, these people who have 60% of all of the cash reserves and the money, they're actually getting the better type of return that they've had for a long time, compared to when interest rates are at record lows and they were getting basically zero return on their money in bank. So it is interesting in terms of, and that's the great thing about economics, right? There's usually a trade-off. If one group's doing well, there's usually another group that suffers, and that's the magic of this very challenging social science.
Oh, absolutely. And well, so everybody, of course, has ideas about interest rates, and I'm sure that this was the purely demographic perspective that I just laid out.
That was going to be the point I was going to ask you, because it's a slightly contrarian view to controlling inflation. So if you had the controls, what would you have done differently, say 6 months ago? Because the inflation was a
So
problem
the cash
child.
rate needed to be hiked. There's no argument about this. But since there is a this is when I listen to the economists, and I believe it's true, that there is a lag effect. So you increase the cash rate and you see the effects about a year later or thereabouts. So I think they rose the cash rate too fast because they were really obsessed with getting this inflation rate down to 3%, and they wanted too much too fast, and that creates panic, if you will. Not panic, but a bit of a dissatisfaction. Maybe that is a crisis we needed to have, because what I've seen and this is where I'm optimistic now. I've seen more talk about actually fixing housing supply, making housing affordability a real priority in the media than I've ever seen in my 16 years in Australia. So finally, the discussion shifts, and maybe you needed to push it over the edge a bit. So, of course, it's easy, in hindsight, to say they should have done it this way. But yeah, so forever the optimist. I'm, however, very positive, very optimistic that there will be no further increase of the cash rate. I think that would be setting all the wrong signals.
Well, it's interesting, obviously, about 3 weeks ago, we saw our results for our GDP, 0.4 growth. But what was also interesting in our accounts, our national accounts data that was released a few weeks back, was the savings ratio. So we've now moved that savings ratio now down to pre or GFC type levels, right? Where we're literally not saving and the amount of money that we've got in banks. So there's no doubt families are hurting. There's no doubt that this tightening cycle has had that effect on spending. So it is going to be really interesting in terms of, to your point, whether we're in contractory territory. We know that it's by design. We want to slow the economy down. We want to stop businesses from charging higher prices for us, because what we did find post the pandemic is we had this huge spike in savings, and we wanted to spend it, and no one was going to stop us from spending it. And so businesses were able to pass on their costs into higher prices, and that's why we got this massive spike in inflation.
Yeah, and to a degree, there is also a bit of an element of, let's call it, national psyche in here. Yeah. Australians are lifestyle-obsessed people that want to spend, that want to enjoy the world. Forcing Australians to not spend their money is very hard. It's easier to do this in Germany. This is a saving obsessed nation that is always afraid to spend money. It's the exact opposite here. People are very happy to experience life at its fullest immediately, and they're willing to spend. So
Yeah,
you're also fighting a bit of an uphill battle against the national psychology.
one of our greatest wishes on this podcast is teaching people about delayed gratification. And we know we've got our work cut out when, exactly to your point, that everyone basically wants to live here and now because, I mean, the conditions in this country are so amazing. But a lot of people don't realise just how wonderful we've got it.
Yeah. Oh, that's absolutely true. So whenever you look at big picture trends, we're really zooming out here in the perspective, trying to understand the role of countries in the global trade network in a future that has lots of challenges. Global warming, this global warming leads to, of course, extreme weather events. We all know that, but it also leads to more movement, more human movement, as certain big stretches of the world become unlivable. People will move. Europe will see more and more forced migration from Africa coming. Managing migration is very difficult.
Yeah.
All of those trends in Australia aren't too much of a worry. Yes, we'll have much more bushfire risks and so forth, but as long as we manage this, we have the easiest to defend borders in the world. It's a breeze to manage this. So all of those big impacts, they are not touching us. In the 1960s, Jeffrey Blaney wrote about the tyranny of distance, that Australia is too far away from all those positive global developments. But by now, the tyranny of distance is more of of a marvelous moat that protects us from unwanted issues and really helps us to dictate who can come into the country and who can't. So population management in Australia will be much easier than anywhere else in the world.
You and Bernard have been on record of saying that Australia's superpower is what you just described, and the fact that we can get so much population growth from people who want to come here, given it's such an appealing place to be. The narrative prior to the pandemic and then the narrative after the pandemic has shifted on that. How much of that superpower is being realised, and how much of a delay was caused by the pandemic for the economic benefits of this country to be realised by that superpower being in play?
So as you mentioned, we got a bit used to just having a high migration intake, and we really planned this into all of our forward-thinking, policy decisions. We always said, 200,000 net new migrants come into the country every year. We got hooked on that. In the first year of the pandemic, instead of taking in 200,000 people, we lost 90,000 people to overseas. So that's almost 300,000 people, most of whom we kind of thought would do some sort of work in Australia, and now we don't have them. That contributed very much to the skills shortage, and hence afterwards we were very pleased after the pandemic from a workforce perspective to amp up migration intake. And we've seen in the financial year just passed, we've seen the highest ever net migration intake in Australian history, almost plus 400,000 people. The previous highest number was plus 300,000 people in 2008, which is when I came to Australia, by the way. So this is massive. This was largely just pent-up demand from the pandemic, because people that wanted to come to Australia, they didn't think badly of Australia. In Australia, we got a bit obsessed temporarily by talking ourselves down with people will not want to come to the lockdown capital of the world or whatever. Well, I guess China took that title from us, and nothing in Australia, or the pulling power, the gravitational pull wasn't diminished in Australia. So people still want to come at high rates. And so we can continue to grow by as much as we desire. The problem that we have in Australia, and it's a bit comical to be honest, is that we still have a national migration policy and a national housing policy that aren't linked. So we can amp up population without ensuring that we have enough housing. That seems like a bit of an oversight, an obvious
A
oversight.
bit.
And that's why we enter this housing affordability crisis. There's nothing that says we can't operate a successful country with 40, 50, 60 million people. We could. uh, as long as we build adequate infrastructure, adequate housing. That is, of course, a big if, but there's no magic number at which a city can't possibly function or something like this.
Well, with that mismatch that you just described, if you're looking in 2030 and you're looking in the rear vision mirror, based on that mismatch, what do you foresee happening for property, given the demand will continue to exceed the supply, and what will our cities look like?
Well, so if we let's forget about 2030, let's really zoom out to the 2080s, because by the mid 2080s we will have doubled the country in size. And this is a play along at home kind of game. In 65 years, we double the Australian population, plus 26 million people. Where do you put those additional 26 million people? One way would be to say, well, from Dubbo to Sydney, every city times two. We double every city. That'd be a way. But we already realized that Melbourne and Sydney stopped functioning under its current one CBD model at around 4.5 million people or thereabouts. So that's probably not the smartest way. You probably want to grow smaller cities at faster rates than you grow the big cities. So you want to make sure that we don't put all of our eggs into the same basket. Remember, we are the most centralized population or most clustered population in the world, meaning there's no country in the world where as high a share of the population lives in its 5 largest cities. We have over 2/3 of the population living in our 5 largest cities. Before the pandemic, over the last 2 decades before the pandemic, 80% of population growth occurred in the top 5 cities. So that means we further densified or further clustered our population. That's probably not smart. Where would we put those 26 million people? I would guess they still want to overwhelmingly hug the coast. So I would therefore expect an absolute boom across the whole eastern seaboard. And that would mean while we double the population, certain towns that have the carrying capacity for larger populations should probably quadruple. Newcastle, beautiful example. Why wouldn't that city, or Wollongong, why wouldn't those cities quadruple in those next 65 years? These, of course, sound like pipe dreams at the moment, but if you're really honest about what Australia would look like in 65 years, you'd say that's probably where we're headed. And then you go, at the moment, this whole idea of the super high-speed rail corridor across the whole eastern seaboard, that is probably financial nonsense at the moment. But at some point, it becomes very feasible. And at some point, it becomes unforgivable to not have it. It's
It's
just
going
a
to be
matter
a
of time.
hyperloop, isn't it, Simon? It's going to be, by 2065, or we'll have the Uber drones will be taking sort of us.
Uber teleport, whatever it is. But all of those technologies, if you have a dense enough population, which
Yeah.
we will have, it's all but certain, it then becomes a necessity. It's just a matter of timing those big infrastructure investments, and to begin with, have an honest discussion as a country where we're headed. It's very plausible that we double in 65 years.
Well,
And
it's an interesting point, right? Because when you think about our nation and the way in which we've grown up, we haven't grown up in high density exposures like, say, our Asian partners. Like, they've got mega cities, 20, 30, 35 million people. And a lot of those people don't know any different. Ultimately, in terms of getting into a lift by yourself would be a unique experience in some of those cities, or being on a train. Whereas we do grow up with a sense of space and less density. So it does make sense that when a bigger city does become too congested and too difficult, that why not? Why not move along the coast? Why not get ourselves into that secondary or tertiary location in terms of what that story looks like?
Absolutely. And here we have to talk about just a beautiful urban planning phenomenon in Australia, the missing middle. It's the idea that in Australia, we either have New York City, which is the inner city, has big skyscrapers, big high apartment towers, and then you step out of the CBD and immediately you move into quarter-acre block territory. Which is ludicrous for a European. And all Europeans that I ever talk to comment about this in Australia, because it just feels odd. And that has to do with the way that Australian cities developed. Before baby boomers grew up, before everyone had a car, we lived in fairly dense cities, in medium rise apartment dwellings. And as soon as baby boomers entered the picture, became adults, they were the first generation for women to enter the workforce at scale. Australian households went from 1 to 1.5 household incomes. This money was spent on labor saving devices, vacuum cleaners, dishwashers, but most importantly, it was spent on cars. And all of a sudden, every family, even of relatively modest means, could drive the car, and just they drove ever further out. Bought a quarter acre block, the next family had to drive 1 block further, and so forth. And so we just sprawled out cities like crazy. And many cities could cope with this for quite a while because you've just built bigger roads. You channeled all those people into this CBD. Not all that many people because you had all those factories in the 60s and 70s and even 80s, in the outskirts of town. So traffic flow was all right. That's how we build cities. Now that all those jobs, this is before the pandemic, all those jobs wanted to go into the city center. Everyone needed to commute into the city at the same time, in the mornings, out of the city at the same time at night. Terrible way of managing traffic that star-shaped system is. And so we figured, a bit more density would be cool. But how do you add medium density? If you think about Europe, Barcelona, London, Stockholm, Berlin, you picture those medium density 4-story buildings. They're called Euroblocks, technically speaking. And a Euroblock, all you need is 12 consecutive quarter acre blocks next to each other. You bulldoze that, you build a Euroblock, you got what is in urban planning circles meant to be the ideal density, because you create relatively cool density by throwing people into large flats. We're talking 3 to 4 bedroom flats in those dwellings, a big inner courtyard, so you can have a relatively green model to density. But you can't do this in Australia after the fact, because how do you even go about buying 12 consecutive quarter acre blocks? It's very, very difficult with land banking and then doing this. And once you finally bought all those flats, once finally all the Greek and Italian grandmothers died at exactly the same time so that you can bulldoze that block, you invested so much capital into that dwelling, you might as well build 50 stories instead of 5. And so the medium density dream in Australia is very difficult. So we do a bit of a half-hearted way of density, where we bulldoze a single quarter acre block and we build 2, 3, 28 crappy townhouses on that block. That's the best we can do in this model. In our big cities, along comes the absolute crazy fantasy of mine of doubling Australia in size over 65 years. And then the outskirts of a Geelong, the outskirts of a Newcastle today would be the middle suburbs of tomorrow. So we would, in a very counterintuitive way, the outskirts of those secondary cities, they should be the places to build medium density if you want that. And of course, medium density needs to be affordable, it needs to be beautiful, it needs to be large. But if I look at the townhouse model that we're building, they are not per se fantastic places to live in. You can easily stack those places because the kind of greenery that you offer the residents, you might as well give them a big balcony. It's such a small bit of green space that we hand out these days. So I think, yes, you can build better dwellings if you stack them to medium density dwellings, but the only locations where you can build them is the current day outskirts, which will be the future middle suburbs. Very, very hard to to justify this, because people are always worried about, is this what the market wants? Thank God, at the moment, the market wants whatever is available, because we have a housing shortage absolutely everywhere and across the whole spectrum of income and everywhere. The whole life cycle of housing has a shortage. So in a sense, this would be a good time to experiment a bit with these kind of developments.
Well, the critical part of that solution that you're talking about there, Simon, is when you get a certain level of density, it does mean that the sort of high streets or the centre promenades can have a choice of restaurants, can have a choice of eateries and wine bars and all, and you get that critical mass. Because one of the biggest challenges of people who experience inner city living in huge urban jungles is the amount of choice that you can, there's multiple restaurants, there's multiple eateries, there's recreational activities, there's gym. The whole ecosystem is thriving. And then when you move out into a suburban area, oh, there's the token Chinese restaurant and maybe the token Indian restaurant or Thai restaurant, but then that's it. And so that whole idea of I can just come down from my balcony, walk around the streets, and I've got choices everywhere and I've got variety. I just lack that variety. And that, to your point, what you're trying to argue is if we get the medium density in around those sort of promenades and those court area and we build from the centre out, then hopefully we've got enough critical variety in there to make those communities point towards those, because we're social creatures, right? That's we're seeing that right now with the CBDs. We're struggling to get people into the office, but on a Friday and Saturday, the city is booming. Everyone needs that, that interaction. Again, biological creatures, social creatures. That's what's happening. We just can't get them in the office during the week. Have you got any thoughts? I mean, it's probably a nice little segue into talking about what's happening in our CBDs and our return to work. Is that a thing, or what's sort of going on in that
Yes.
space?
So, quick comment about the more denser you live,
Yeah.
the more choice you have, the more businesses become viable, but also the cheaper it is to run a city. Our sprawled out cities are outrageously expensive to run because Berlin, compared to Melbourne, has a population density that is 4 times higher. That means each Berliner needs to pay for only the quarter of road and rail kilometers compared to a Melburnian. So the denser you are, the better streets and rails you can offer to your people. So there is also a certain quality of life that comes into this. Also, one of the big issues that we have in the coming decade that is not going to go away is the skills shortage. The skills shortage that we are experiencing right now. Yes, there was a COVID impact, but it is very much baked into the demographic pie, because for the next 10 years, we will continue to see the large baby boomer cohort retire, big population cohort out. That's fine. They're allowed to retire. They worked hard. Also, in the past, people retired, so it's nothing new. But in the past, when a cohort retired, you had a equally sized, or usually actually a larger cohort, enter the world of work at the other end of the spectrum. This time, we got big cohort out, small cohort in. That's an imbalance. As if this wasn't bad enough, we have the millennials procrastinating for so many years, making babies for the next 12, 13, 14 years. That means they leave the world of work at least temporarily. And because they are the biggest cohort, that is quite significant. So the skills shortage is here to stay. That means we can't simply rely on saying, we just build all those new roads. You want to densify, you want to minimize the need for labor. Individual businesses, of course, can look at automation, they can look at AI, but as a system, we need to also become smarter. If we build more and more houses that need to be renovated in 30, 40 years, yes, that's bad for the environment, or renovated, completely overhauled, pulled down. That's bad for the environment, sure, but it's also, and it's expensive, but it's also unrealistic to say that we'll have the labor in 10 years' time to do all of this. So the competition for labor will be higher and higher. So that is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, because I think what's interesting with what you've said is I think that I reckon Australians would adopt it once it's in. It's just someone taking a punt to make that happen. I mean, I watched a movie last night, Denzel Washington, Equalizer 3, and it was based around a piazza in a town in, I'm pretty sure it was Naples, in the southern part of Italy. And the community was amazing. The people were getting involved with the vendors, and it created a sense of community that I think that really is an unfortunate gap in the Australian culture. So I think that once it's here, Geelong and Wollongong and Newcastle, but it's really how big is the gap in your mind from the existing track that's been laid? No one's going to do it in the CBD. Someone's got to take a punt. It feels like that bridge is a long bridge to get that gap.
It might look like a big step, but really, if you think about this housing crisis, there is not enough housing stock available. So people will move there by sheer necessity to begin with. Also, everyone, of course, has very unrealistic um, dreams of a house. Yeah, everybody wants a 7-bedroom villa with a swimming pool at the beach for $400,000. Uh, but there are a few of them around, so we all need to make compromises. But the one thing Aussies are not willing to compromise on is the number of bedrooms in the house. This is housing preference research, shows this absolutely clearly. We have a strict formula in our head: bedroom for mom and dad, 1 bedroom for each kid. And if they are knowledge workers, now we need a Zoom room, a study in the house as well. So a 2-kid family needs 4 bedrooms. If you offer a 4-bedroom setup as an apartment, as a townhouse, as whatever, and people will go there, and then they will move. They'll change, they'll adjust their lives around this. It's quite significant that.
So the people will adopt it. We just got to get the developers to back themselves in and know that the market will adopt it.
Exactly. It of course needs to make sense. Is this a project that is too difficult to pull off? Is somebody just throwing a hissy fit at council about this? All of these are big issues, and I'm thinking if a council really realizes, we want more workers, we want to attract more things, build it yourself. Such a medium density development is ultimately a low risk thing to pull off. It's a couple of millions of dollars. Boohoo. You burned more money in the past. Half of this money will probably come from some federal fund for God knows what. You'll partially get private investors in it. It is ultimately a low risk play. Plus, you will not burn the whole lot of the investment. It'll make some sort of sense. It's just a matter of, is it a home run? Is it a mediocre success? I want people to risk it more. We need diversity of housing offering. And when I talk to people in industry, there is so much of an appetite for new experiments. Co-living is being talked about. Build to rent obviously is a whole new asset class that will enter the market at scale. All of these things are coming. And in the back, we want to think, the shift in the mindset of politics now is they realized supply is the most important
Yeah,
thing. They
okay.
want to amp up housing supply.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, but my sources and what I've read about the turn of the century. So when we talked about the early 1900s in Australia, housing density was on average 6 people per household, and in terms of ownership, it was 30% ownership, 70% renters. Now, it was through obviously after the Second World War and the Menzies era, and in through the 50s and 60s that we started to have the Great Australian Dream. And that was the quarter acre block, as you were talking about. And then the car made that possible in terms of the commutable into the city locations. So it is, coming back to your point before, change does occur, but it just takes a little bit longer. If we think about a yearly change, we can't see much of it. But when you talk about 100, 120 years of change, we've actually done a great job of giving more people home ownership. And housing density, I now think, is around 2.3 or 2.1 to 2.3. So we've been very fortunate, in terms of the economic prosperity that we've had as a country, that now, to Simon's point and to all the research, we want a separate bedroom for each of our childs. I mean, back in the 1920s, you were in almost like a boarding house where your uncles and aunties were living there, and the brothers and sisters were in the same bedroom. So we tend to forget about that. So I think to Simon's point and to our town planners and to our governments, they've got to start to think about this higher density story and start to do those changes that are needed in the existing locations so we can get a bit of that backfill and a bit more of that density coming through in the existing locations, because the economics work, don't they, Simon?
Oh, absolutely. This was an absolutely lovely, quick history lesson. Very, very correct, everything. And you want to remember that right now, why we are so obsessing about home ownership. First and foremost, of course, it's a nice feeling, blah, 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 all that as well. But it is a financial necessity. We are growing old as a nation like crazy. It is very hard to finance an aging population. We were really smart in the 1990s to push superannuation through.
Yeah.
In theory, if your well, not in theory, if your income is high enough, through superannuation, you put enough money aside that you pay for your own retirement. That is a different way of saying government doesn't need to pay for your retirement. The pension scheme doesn't need to pay for your retirement. So we want as many people as possible in jobs that pay enough money. So if you get a cheap Uber Eats order delivered every night, yes, it's cool, cheap delivery, congratulations, but you'll pay for this eventually, as this Uber Eats driver will not put enough money into their retirement fund with their low income. You will pay for this cheap Uber Eats order whenever this driver is retired, because you will pay on the pension scheme. So that's one thing, is we want to automate as many of those low income jobs as humanly possible. There's a skills shortage anyway, so we'll not even create hordes of unemployed people. So that's cool. Also, the one thing that keeps you safe from poverty in old age is home ownership, simply because the housing costs as a homeowner are much, much lower once you paid off your mortgage than they are as a renter. So before they go into retirement, we want absolutely we won't get everyone, but as many people as possible into home ownership. So this is why we need a whole different variety of homes to push people into. That is absolutely fantastic, because then we don't need to use the pension scheme, because that can become incredibly expensive. It can become forbiddingly expensive as a nation, and most importantly, it can create social unrest. If I look at a country like Germany, where there's one big retirement bucket and everyone is putting their money into the bucket. There's a formula. You put that much money in, you get that much money out, but it's one bucket. And in theory, government can do whatever they want with this bucket. And so at some stage, there will be a German treasurer that can do numbers, and they'll realize Germany is aging much more than Australia. And they'll say, we need to freeze pension payouts. We need to maybe even shrink them. And what will happen then, politically speaking? Those old, angry people will vote for any charlatan who says, we'll give you the same pensions as always. That creates political instability, either a political unrest or financial instability in the system. We avoided this, systemically speaking, in Australia through the super scheme. This is a much underrated benefit of superannuation in this country. So that is really cool. And of course, add home ownership on this. That's fine, which is why I'm a bit nervous if you have a big generation that has home ownership at a very low rate, because who's going to pay for their housing once they're in retirement? It is going to be society as a whole, and you want to avoid
100%.
that. So push people into home ownership.
Geez, there's been some incredible insights that hopefully our audience hopefully listens to a couple of times. Before you talked about that the fact that the unemployment rate is so low is actually good, because it'll force businesses to innovate under pressure. And you've touched on AI. Can we expand on this a little bit further? So how will businesses need to embrace that? How can they use the current low unemployment environment to benefit from that? And what's the overall benefit to people in the community, particularly a message to those who might be a bit fearful of what AI might bring?
Yeah. So fear not. Yes, you've seen the Terminator, you've seen the Matrix. I know AI and sounds scary because it could take over the world and so forth. Don't worry about it. The skills shortage that we have is so severe that even with the most incredible AI innovations, there will be always plenty enough work for humans to do. But AI is going to change the way we do work. The first observation is that AI will not kill jobs; it will kill tasks. It will speed up tasks. Creating a chart, a map, that will be faster in the future. An annual report will be faster written through AI. That frees up time for individual workers. But, to misquote Jurassic Park, work finds a way to fill your day, that is. And so the kind of tasks that will fill your day after AI took up a couple of your technical, repetitive tasks, these tasks will be interpersonal, they will be collaborative in nature. So in a very, very counterintuitive way, AI humanizes the world of work. AI brings us together. AI ensures that we talk to each other more. also, this leads to the reason why I think that AI is going to be the saving grace for commercial real estate, for offices. Over the last couple of years, well, let's put it this way: before the pandemic, for decades, everything pushed people into the office because we transitioned from a manufacturing economy into a service, into a knowledge economy. Those knowledge jobs benefited from being clustered together in the same office. And then, of course, the office tower of accountants benefited by being next to the office tower full of bankers, next to the office tower full of business people. That created a healthful ecosystem while the CBD boomed. Along comes the pandemic. Along comes cool technological software that allows us to work from home and so forth. So we push people away from the office. Then people, as they worked from the office, they realized, hey, that's actually better. I avoid the soul-destroying commute. And now they fight tooth and nail to not come to the office all that often. They also realize especially the young millennials, they now moved from the inner city where they lived when they were not families just yet. They moved to the urban fringe because that was the only place where they could afford family-sized houses now that they have families. So they now moved all the way away. And that's really bad for commercial real estate. Commercial real estate is struggling, is going to continue to struggle in the immediate future. But now, what will happen with AI is that all of a sudden you have more excuses to come to the office, more reasons to do so. Because if you split your work tasks into two main categories, the first category being quiet thinking tasks, writing emails, programming, reading stuff, you do that at home. There's no need to come to the office to put on noise canceling headphones and to then write an email. That's dumb. That's a waste of everybody's time. But we do know that you need to create team culture by being together. You create learning opportunities from one generation to the next, from one worker to the next, by people coming to the office. So we know that there will be not a remote working environment, but there will be a hybrid environment, which is why, by the way, you don't need to be afraid that, if we work from home, they will just give all the jobs to people in the Philippines. No, they won't, because they can only do the repetitive technical tasks there. They cannot do the interpersonal human tasks from the Philippines. Hybrid is the way forward, which is why at the moment we see this magical 2-hour drive time radius around the CBD emerging. This is where people sit in because they still want to go to the office or need to go to the office occasionally. Is it once? Is it twice per week? Who cares? But that means outside of this 2 hour, nothing is happening, or those people are not going. But then AI all of a sudden creates more interpersonal tasks. So all of a sudden, each worker bee will need to go to the office a bit more frequently. That fills up the office towers bit by bit. At the same time, simple population growth continues to occur. And yes, the new workers that move into our big cities, they go to the office less frequently than they would have done 5-6 years ago. But hey, there's heaps more. So eventually the office towers will fill up, only thanks due to population growth and AI. Counterintuitive, but so fear AI not. And you will see technology all over the shop, and you will bit by bit understand that this technology is actually helping you to free up labor that is much needed. Not in a direct way. For example, if you go to the footy on the weekend, in 2 years' time, I think it is unthinkable that a human will check your ticket, that a human will pour your beer at halftime. That's silly. Machines can do this just as well. So why wouldn't they? And these are big enough entities to make the investments happening so that will occur. It doesn't mean that this particular worker that checked your tickets will instead run to the aged care home and take care of people. But this is a systemic shift of jobs, and we need heaps more aged care workers. This is a job where we'll not have technology help out as much. We'll not have robots flipping old people in the care homes. That's not going to happen. But in a population or in an environment where doubling the 85 plus cohort in the next 12 years, half of that cohort needs care. We need heaps more workers. So all of this AI that frees up work elsewhere is channeling population, or is enabling populations to take on jobs in much more needed tasks, categories. So that will hopefully be our saving grace, AI that is.
And to your point, I mean, we started the conversation off around the pressure on inflation, and obviously with higher wages, more spending, that would put continued pressure on inflation. The one thing that puts counterbalance to that inflation pressure is productivity. And usually you get that through technology advancement and that type of innovation that we've just been talking about, because that is where the input costs become less. And so obviously if there is higher wages paid to those more skilled workers, that's great. You can accommodate that, but you don't necessarily have to pass on those additional costs in higher prices. You can actually find those savings in higher productivity. So I think that's a really good message. I just wanted to tap in also to this city and office culture and business culture story. I recently heard a CEO of a major bank talk about his decision to instruct all of his senior managers and leadership people into the office on a full-time basis. And his argument to that was around culture, and how can we set the example of culture if the senior people aren't, that it's not a trickle-down type culture aspect. Have you got any views on the importance of culture in the workplace? And I know how this relates to, again, this sort of reinforces, this is a property podcast about where are we going to see demand for property, but I think this reinforces that 2-hour commute window in terms of that story, because in addition to the AI story in terms of bringing people in to do that cooperative work using their new co-pilot AI.
Yeah. So when we talk about the whole stick about getting people back to the office, bosses tend to throw around 3 arguments. The first one is about productivity. My staff is more productive in the office than at home. They have zero proof whatsoever for this. If anything, people are more productive at home. Measuring productivity is almost impossible. The best proxy is working time, working hours. We work longer at home. So I would say productivity, I'm discounting this as an argument. Then the culture argument, as you mentioned, the bank there. They say, well, in order to create this team spirit, this team culture, we need to be together in a room, all together as a team, and that creates this culture. That is absolutely perfectly true. And there's a bit of research when I read it, it blew me away, that said, yes, you do need to be in the office at the same time as a team. But whether you do this 1 day per week or 5 days per week does not make any difference. Blew my little mind away when I read this, because I figured surely 5 times, the time makes a big difference. But then I realized, wait a second, I played social sports for many years with my friends, and I hung out 2 hours per week with a bunch of guys playing futsal, and I considered them my best mates. I realized, wait a second, so that's probably a decent enough comparison. So 1 day per week will probably do the trick if everyone is together and if you actually utilize this time. The third argument why people say you need to come back to the office is learning, is knowledge transfer. And that needs more than a day. Simply because if you think back to your early career days in the office, you probably asked, I'm making up this number, you asked 72 questions a day about the copy machine, about the fax machine, God knows whatever the technology was back then. But you asked heaps of questions, you overheard phone calls, you learned how to write an email, how to book a meeting room, all those things. You learned heaps of stuff. You still ask questions if you work remotely, because you'll have a buddy assigned, you'll have a manager, but you'll ask 30 questions, whatever it is. The numbers don't matter, but you ask heaps fewer questions. So what that means is organizations now need to create deliberately need to create those events that just happened magically as a byproduct of sitting in the office. So we probably arrive at a necessity of people coming to the office. Let's call it 2.5 days.
Yeah.
So that is needed. Dictating a full-time office attendance, that's one way of doing this. It's a very, very dictatorial leadership style. I'm very interested in the staff retention numbers a year in after this. And you do this in a time of record low unemployment, where each senior manager of this bank can easily switch to a different colored bank and get the same pay, might as well get a pay rise and work in whatever way she wants. So that's probably not a smart move, I must say, but I'm happy to stand corrected.
Nice and humble answer there. Hey, can we just round out the 2-hour commuter belt discussion? A bunch of people rushed out to the regions. beyond 2 hours in pandemic times. We're now post-pandemic. In between now and your Euro blocks appearing in those towns, so in that gap, what's going to happen to the people who had that big exodus and they're now sort of going, oh,
Yeah, so let's look about 15 years into the future, because whoever is dealing in property do not retire before 2045 or thereabouts. This is going, you have the wildest decade in the 2030s ahead. What I mean by this has to do with the intergenerational wealth transfer. It has to do with dying baby boomer women. What I mean by this is, if you ask your financial advisor, they will tell you from a wealth transfer perspective, yes, it is best to hand money from one generation to the next while everybody is still alive. The bank of mom and dad is a way of doing this. Paying for the grandkids' childcare is a way of doing this. But these are awkward conversations with your parents, with your kids about money. You need to come to terms with your own mortality. These are just awkward things, so we don't do them. So ultimately, as Australians, we hand money from one generation to the next when the last parent dies. And that's mom, because mom is 3 years younger than dad and she has 4 years longer life expectancy. So all we need, and this is coming back to the 2-hour commuter belt, I promise. So this means that those, we know when those women will be dying. This is when wealth transfer occurs. We know where those women live. Those women live in quarter-acre block type dwellings in the middle suburbs. They will die at an increasing rate. Let's call them instances of intergenerational wealth transfer to have it less morbid. You'll have about 77,000 instances of intergenerational wealth transfer this year. This will grow by 60-70% and will peak in the year 2041. So the whole 2030s and most of the 2040s will see elevated rates of intergenerational wealth transfer. This is when the people living in the middle suburbs are dying. What will happen? Well, they will not have downsized their homes beforehand. They will be carried out of their family home. I guess that's the ultimate downsizing, into the little box. But more than anything, this means this dwelling becomes available. What will her 2.5 kids do? Her 2.5 kids will bulldoze the quarter-acre block. They will build townhouses on top. They will build a nice luxury house on top. They will sell it for a profit. This profit they will use to pay down their mortgage. They will then use the remaining money to do what Australians always do when they come into money: buy an investment property. All of this wealth transfer will turbocharge the spending capacity. It, in a weird way, leads to the densification through townhouses mostly of the middle suburbs. So that means in these 2030s, the middle suburbs are, of course, still an expensive area to buy in. So it's not be the young ones that buy in there. It will be the millennials that move to the regions, to the outer suburbs, that will then see an opportunity to upgrade because they'll have annoying teenagers by then, and they will take their kids and move to the middle suburbs into those new dwellings. So you have the highest movement. People stay in homes much shorter in the 2030s than they've done in the past because there's so much new stock coming online. And so this allows society to right-size their housing, especially if we kill stamp duty by then and have a land tax, because then there are less hurdles to change houses. So you'll have this biggest migration internally in Australian history ever. And if, let's say, you are a mortgage broker or a real estate agent, you by now should have fainted with joy of this prospect of the 2030s.
Well, I'm thinking that property investors who are nervous about whatever's happening in the current marketplace should definitely listen to this episode twice, because there is so much reason for optimism based not just on the last 5 minutes, but on the last 45 minutes.
Well, because this is the piece of the puzzle that most people forget about, and that is that, buying a brand new property in 2030 or 2040 when they're worth $3 or $4 or $5 million, they think no one can borrow that sort of money. But you're not. You're actually borrowing $1 to $2 million because you've just had that wealth transfer, and ultimately, and $1 to $2 million again with your incomes. Your average income might be in that sort of 140, 150, 160 double household income. So you've got average household incomes 300, 350. Some people on $400,000 to $500,000. This is why land values and productive use of land in terms of, changing it from a single use to a double use. Because what Simon's also highlighted in that is the parents who have the two kids. It's not just one of the kids gets to, let's do a substitution of house, because I'm sitting there with my new wife and my kids and I want to go and live in Hawthorne. But there's, I've got a sister or a brother who also has their family and they would love to live in the same. So, to stop World War III, it's basically we're going to have to sell that house and then realise the profit of that. Now, one of us might buy the other one out and then knock that home over and build their own dream home or renovate the existing. But that's that's wealth on wealth effect, right? That's the compounding effect in real numbers, in human action and human behavior, compared to just everyone looking at, compound just won't work like that. Well, I tell you, it does in real life.
It's a beautiful point, because you've got an LVR across the market of around 22%, and people are assuming that's going to jump up to 80%. It's not. For what Simon's just said, it just means that the equity shift will transfer to different people's balance sheets, but that LVR across the market will probably rise a little bit, but not systemically break it.
There you go. And that's why I'm just really excited about the 2030s. Just intellectually speaking, there is going to be so much movement. On top of this, you'll still see high population growth. Most likely, we'll probably by then have shifted to grow smaller cities at faster rates. Because how much densification do you want to do? You want to decentralize jobs a bit more. All this is written in policy. We'll see whether this actually eventuates, but it suggests a very dynamic Australia. And so this is also a friendly reminder to everyone that this is a very agile country. Your suburb will look differently. I don't care where you are, but your suburb will look differently in 10, in 20 years. There's always change. And if I'm looking at our young people that lived through the pandemic in their formative years, so school-aged kids and teenagers and so forth, they will be very, very capable of dealing with change. So because we say whatever happens in your formative years, that changes your worldview or shapes your worldview in a lasting way. So I'm very pleased that the young people will probably deal with this in a very good way. But us more experienced people, we need to be aware of there will be change. We need to be very, very comfortable with change. And it's a given. So don't fight it. Just try to understand what's happening. Try to always channel change, channel growth into the most effective way. Growth doesn't need to mean that life for you will suck. It can just mean that life ultimately improves, but you need to work on it. Because if you just
become yimbys.
Yeah, they do need to become yimbys. And I think that's a really nice way to close out this conversation. Often we get too caught up in the negative sentiment and the negative things that are being said and in the here and now. And yes, we do have a housing crisis and a shortage. And, obviously in the 1920s, we talked about the roaring 20s, and we've had Bernard on, we've had Simon on talking about what the future looks like. Now, we thought, maybe the 2020s were going to also again be another period of the roaring 20s. Well, we're coming into 2024 probably in a position where our economies are slowing. We also saw from our national accounts figures that per capita we're actually in recession. It's only been that migratory increase of people that's actually increasing economic activity to get us the 0.4 of 1% growth rate that we had in the quarter GDP. But I think it's just a really great reason why we get people like Simon, who are experts in their field, to come on to the pod, to just lift our eyes and to start thinking in decades, not just thinking in years, because it sounds to me like the 2030s and the 2040s with this wealth transfer, this intergenerational wealth transfer, are going to be the roaring 30s and 40s in terms of what that story might look like. But we've got to embrace this change. We've got to accept that we're going to have higher densities in our existing areas, and our property neighbourhoods are going to look different. And to me, it's like, again, I keep coming back to land to asset ratio. If I can put 3 or 4 improvements on a piece of land and get its higher productive use where I want it, that is going to make that land worth a lot more expensive and potentially higher yielding for me as well. So, Simon, I just want to say a huge thank you from my point of view. You might have one last question, but before I wrap up my piece, you've got a brand new book out coming out in early October called Marvelous Maps. I don't know whether you've got a copy of it there, but Oh, there it is. Okay, so a nice little plug for this.
Why do you love maps so much, Simon? Help us out. Why do you love maps so much? Your Twitter feed is full of maps.
I love maps because it is the most condensed visual form of data.
Yeah.
It is storytelling in a quick, visual, complex way, and that's enjoyable in my little mind. Yeah, so it's a fast way of consuming complex information, and the idea of just yeah, if you follow me on my social media channels, you'll see that I constantly share maps
Yeah, they're
and
great.
charts that
I
explain
love
how the world works. And the idea is that by just constantly consuming this information, you gain some sort of background knowledge of what's shaping this planet, and that will ultimately make you a better decision maker
Yeah.
in all things really that
Agreed.
impact business or policy and so forth. Yeah.
Or property
So
investing.
Yeah. Imagine that. So that book comes out in October. So folks can just Google that, Amazon, wherever they get good books. We're going to definitely get our hands on that.
Yep.
My final question is challenging because I don't want to wrap up. Is the honest
Yeah.
truth? I've had multiple conversations with you over the journey, Simon, and every time I get something new and insightful and further reinforces my optimism about this country and the opportunity that we have. But what would you say to the Ben and I get a lot of people write into us saying, yeah, you guys keep talking about and largely on the back of insights from you and Bernard and the like, you guys keep talking about the Roaring Twenties, but the last time we had the Roaring Twenties, it was followed by the Great Depression. So I feel like in the 1930s, right? So I feel like we've covered a lot of ground today that hopefully will give those pessimists a bit of comfort
Food for thought.
about why that is. But what would you say to someone? As a summary point and a way for us to finish this conversation, for someone to say, history says the last time the 1930s weren't that great. Why would the 2030s be any different?
well, first and foremost, it is a bit simplistic to say we'll relive the same century year after year. This is not Groundhog Day here. This is this is
Well, it's
real
just the
history.
excitement and the economic
Yeah.
energy and all the boom that went through the 20s.
So there are a couple of challenges globally speaking. An aging planet will have slowdown. It means that capital will be looking to more boring investment. So that's because that's what you would tell your
Healthcare.
individual client as a wealth advisor. You'd say have more boring investments in your old age, have more exciting investments in your young age. So it means it is not all that easy to get enough capital for your new Googles and Facebook type startups. So that's that sounds like a negative story, but it means who has lots of boring investment opportunities. It is a stable democracy like Australia. On top of this, we realized because lots of people are pessimistic about the future because of the environment. They say we're burning through the planet. We're just we can't live like this. Limited resources, finite resources, and so forth. So yeah, I get that, but the absolute counterintuitive gift that Australia has to offer over the coming decade is mining. Mining is, of course, how we make money. We run a super simplistic economy in this country. We make money by selling mining products, agriculture products, education, and tourism to the world. That's all we do in this country. And all of this will be fine in the coming decades. Food prices will go up globally. Terrible news for the bottom 2 billion people on this planet. Great news for any food exporter. Back to mining. We are realizing as a population, as a global population, that we need to green the planet. We need to electrify the global transport network. We cannot go on with this fossil fuel economy forever onwards. So what does that mean? It means electrification. Electrification means you need to put batteries into your vehicles to make the world move. A battery needs 8 essential mining products. We have those products in this country. The demand, the price for those products will go through the roof. We will benefit from this as a country. Our products will not just be in demand because they are in demand to begin with. They will be in demand because those mining products, they are distributed across the globe, yes, but not evenly, and they tend to not be clustered in stable democracies. There are precious few stable democracies that have a mining wealth on offer. So just from a supply chain sovereignty perspective, our mining will be in high demand. And the perspective that we have on mining will turn almost 180 degrees from a dirty, evil, polluting, think brown coal, think oil type industry, to the industry that makes the green revolution happen. It is bizarre to think about this at the moment, but that'll benefit us. From an environmental accounting perspective, we have a couple of challenges. Because whenever you dig a big hole in the ground, you kill an ecosystem. There's no discussion about this. So environmental accounting needs to make sure that we say for every 100, ecosystem pain points, we need to create, let's call it 150 positive environmental points. You see where I'm getting there? So that's absolutely crucial. We can do this. The big challenge for Australia in the coming decades will be to capture this mining wealth in a smart and equitable way. I would very much favor a Norwegian style or a Singaporean style sovereign wealth fund for our mining profits. Yeah, so that would I would enjoy that.
Yes,
We
we all would.
yes.
Just whether the political will is there, and because there's a lot of pressure.
Hey, Simon, that was terrific.
Yeah, wonderful.
For our community, you can see why we're always very, very keen to have Simon come and join us. So on behalf of all of the mind-blown community that have just listened to our conversation, thanks for joining us on the Property Couch today.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Simon.
Oh, mate, how good was that? It's funny. I have these predetermined ideas of where I think the conversation might go because I spend a bit of time. I revisit the previous conversations. I go and see what's relevant. But some of the stuff we talked about, even I wasn't anticipating, and I was so glad we went there.
Yeah, and obviously, we pre-recorded that, and here we are in terms of reflecting on that. And I really, I've had a couple of days to reflect on what was sort of said, and it just reminds me again of the glass half full concept that we were talking about at the start of the show, and that is this whole idea that what's our population going to double by 2065? We've got all this interesting technology that's going to make us a lot more productive. Where does that take us in the world? What is it going to mean in terms of the overall, intergenerational wealth transfer? I'm going to be talking more about that in What's Making Property News. I've got some data on that. So it's just a solid story to just remember to lift our eyes, think in the decades, think in the long term. And when you start thinking like that, you can just get on with your life, not worrying about your investments, which comes back to your initial life hack point in terms of do these things really well, boringly well. And that's the thing I love about property investing, right? It is a small business, but it's a passive investing small business. Like it doesn't require a hell of a lot of your time. You can go and set up a cafe and make 500,000 coffees over the next sort of 20 or 30 years. And that's required. This is a really nice business that you can run on the side, almost like a life hack or a side hustle, where you can run that business. You have a property manager helping you out. You have professional advisors who are helping you out. But it's just it's value adding. And I just think, look at Berkshire Hathaway. At the end of the day, Berkshire Hathaway, what's their business? They buy other businesses and they let their managers run those other businesses. And it's one of the richest businesses in the world. Yeah. So, and they're passive investors in those businesses. Yeah. So it's success leaves clues. Yeah. And, that just reminds me of what is a really, really good story.
Yeah, I remember being a younger lad, Ben, back in Perth in the late 90s, and I picked up the book The Big Shift by Bernard Salt. And I was just fascinated by, at that time, the fact that you could see all these movements. He had this, if you imagine this cross in the map, and he said this was the centre of Australia based on population, equal north, equal south, equal east, equal west. He was talking about baby boomers. I found it fascinating, and I don't think, we've spoken to Simon, we've spoken to Bernard, we've had Simon speak to our team, we've had feedback from our team that everyone just seems to be fully engaged whenever people like him are talking about how we move and what we're doing. It's kind of, I don't know what it is about us humans, but we just love to look into the future and see what that looks like. So, and folks, if you I remember Bernard did a talk just before, I can't remember when it was, if I'm honest, but it was in the noughties that I saw. And he said, wherever there's noise, go to the facts. Right. And I've now used that as a guiding philosophical principle in life for property investing. Wherever there's noise, go to the facts. And so we're in a period of extreme noise right now. And so wherever there's noise, go to the facts. And as soon as you listen to what he said, the fact that by 2080, there's 52 million people. There's, just the next 2 decades alone will be super exciting. The fact that we are the most clustered population in the world. So when you arrive in Australia, you hug the coast, you stay in those 5 main capital cities. There is just so much to be excited about. And then he goes, well, if 26 million people are coming here, where are they going to go? Are they all going to go? No, they're going to create these Euro blocks and these other areas and those other new satellite cities. It's just exciting. It's just exciting to observe and watch. So if you're wondering if you should be investing in property, I hope that conversation leaves you with zero doubt that as you get to 2030 and you do the customary rear vision mirror review on did I make the right decision? Did I make the right choices? If you put your name on a title or two in that decade, chances are you're going to think, I'm glad I did that.
I mean, look, there's always risk in anything that you invest in. And in our case, probably some of the biggest challenges we've got are around regulatory and government interference in the marketplace. That's the short-term risk. But if you lift your eyes up, what you're trying to do as an investor is get the probability of outcome in your favour, right? You're trying to look for that arbitrage opportunity. And if all these people need to move here, they're going to have to live somewhere. And that's the productive use of that land. And then ultimately, when you're thinking about the doubling of the size of our population, you're thinking about the economic activity that creates and the economic growth and the wealth creation that comes off that is a significant story that obviously gives really good, strong, predictable probability that property prices and land values and those things are going to keep growing, and you're going to get a return on that.
There you go, folks. Thank you, Simon. We appreciate your insights. We will definitely be getting Simon on again in the future. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is if you enjoyed that, there's a back catalogue in our series where you can go and listen to more demographers. So obviously you've just heard Simon now. He's previously, he and I had a conversation in episode 353 when you were away. Then me and him had a conversation episode 314. Then we spoke to his business partner, Bernard Salt. That was episode 334. And then way back in episode 185, you and I had a conversation. Remember this, Ben? Mark McCrindle, he was in the studio with us as well. Had some amazing infographics, had similar conversations around demographics. These people love numbers and love turning numbers into stories, and they're really, really insightful. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop the links to these past episodes into the show notes. And my life hack for people today is go and absorb them. Go and have a listen to them. Some of the conversations we had back then, like episode 185 was a long time ago. But listen to some of those trends and patterns and see how they've come about and what they've actually meant for property investors and how they've actually flowed through. Because these guys are just saying, we have life cycles. We're born, we know our date of birth. We roughly know our date of death based on averages. And we roughly know the typical things that you're going to do in your lifetime. And baby boomers had a different life cycle to us as Gen X, to Gen Y. Now millennials have got different life cycles. So they just make these reasonable predictions based on reasonable assumptions around what people are going to do at what stage of life. So that is my life hack today, Ben. I think you'll be glad you did go back and revisit those episodes. What's making property news, mate?
Well, I just thought let's build on that. It's been a big, long show, so I don't want to take up too much of the time, but I want to talk about the intergenerational wealth transfer by the numbers. And so Treasury, that's obviously a federal treasury of this country, has already reported that the baby boomers, and remember, in a lot of cases, there's upwards of 5,000 people a week who are retiring, right? So people need to put that into context. They're getting access to super. So there's already been $1.5 trillion worth of intergenerational wealth transfer from some of those older baby boomers. But that is about, to Simon's point, based on the Productivity Commission and NAB, National Australia Bank's research, that's going to be $3.5 trillion over the next 2 decades. 3.5 trillion. Now, if you don't know how much a trillion is, that is 1,000 billion, all right, in terms of what's going to be coming through. So that in itself, 1,000 billion. That's basically what's going to be coming through. So I think from that point of view, I don't really need to say any more other than that they are big numbers. And that is what we talked about with Simon when we were trying to argue the case that doesn't mean that loan volumes are going to explode. It just means some of that wealth is going to be, we're going to start thinking about wealth from a family point of view and how we, basically make that wealth transfer, and we start thinking about what we do as a family, generation by generation, in protecting that wealth and potentially growing that wealth over time.
So, folks, if you're listening to this, did anyone have an aha when Ben said that in the interview or when he just said it then? Because a lot of people go and say property prices cannot continue to rise, Bryce, because the DTI says that it's not going to work. Our incomes won't grow at a level that will allow the property prices to grow. And so hopefully there was just this big aha moment that people are listening to this going, oh, right, it's not going to all be debt funded. It's all going to be part of equity passed on through generations, which will form part of the ability to buy for people at higher prices, and throw that in the mix where we've got more people who want to live in these houses than we have stock available. Hopefully that was the aha moment for a lot of people, because they go, when they do the projections and they go 7%, takes 10 years to double and then double again, they look at that, it's mind-boggling. I just can't see it happening. Hopefully that was a penny drop moment for everyone.
Yeah, and to that point, those people who want to get into the market and how challenging, this is how the market works. You do go to the fringes, or go back to the buyer's decision quadrant. You'll look at the type of asset that you start on the property journey with. It's most likely going to be a unit. Then you'll potentially go to a townhouse, and if you're fortunate enough, or if you've got a wealth transfer happening, you'll go into a property in those mega cities. If you think about what Paul Ryan said about the gravitational pull towards the mega city, that won't stop, right? Like, when we think about Melbourne and Sydney as population centres in that sort of 5 million, 6 million range, in global terms, they just fall out of the top 100 cities in the world in terms of population. So, like, there are mega cities. And in those mega cities, we need to look at the land value and what they're building on those and the productive use of that. And then you start thinking about where all the mega successful people live. They live in certain communities, that land value, all of that. So that trickles down, and we call it the ripple effect in terms of land values across the nation and all of those things. So that does mean that in some cases, the Adelaides and the smaller cities, the Geelongs and the Peninsulas and all of those areas will continue to grow based on the affordability story in those bigger centres. So those people who are fortunate enough that can live, i.e. in the New Yorks or in Parises or the Londons of this world, or in our case, the Sydneys or Melbourne, that'll continue. But there will be these other centres which will be more affordable. Now, that the incomes that you earn in those centres won't be as large as what you can earn in these mega cities. But that's just a choice that you'll get to make in this great country. And you've got to think about it like that. And from an investor's point of view, there will always be opportunity in all those different markets. So it's really about your own investment strategy in terms of what you would do as part of your story in terms of where you would invest and why you would invest in those locations.
Now, Ben, our audience needs to know officially that they've been warned. So someone will be listening to this as we release it. So they are the people that we're trying to give a heads up to. Someone will listen to this episode in the future, Ben, 2 years from now, right? And then the circumstances would have changed. But the people who are listening to it now, you have been warned that you can get an opportunity to buy into a marketplace where Tim Lawless has just told us there's probably going to be a little bit more stock on the market in spring, and you can do it whilst the masses are still a little bit nervous. But as soon as it ticks into 2024 and then it gets the run going, don't say that you weren't warned. Simon's warned us today. We've talked about some of that now. There's an opportunity for you. There will be a point where you look in the rear vision mirror and you go, oh, there was an opportunity for me to be able to afford real estate back then. and I didn't take that opportunity. So hopefully
Yeah,
you
those people who have got gainful employment, safe employment, this is, again, there's going to be a pause in the market. So this is your time to reconfirm a long-term view and act on it in the short term.
Well, there we go, and act on it in the short term. So there you go, folks. It was a big episode. We covered a lot of ground. We actually think that if I just reinforce what I said at the top of the show, if you got value out of listening to Simon in that episode, would you please share it with your friends? Screenshot it, send them a text, do whatever it takes on however you communicate, and ask them to listen to this. So, mate, it's always been fun. It's always fun having a chat with Simon. Always good hanging out with you, mate. Until next week.
Knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it, because your future self will thank you for it.
Oh, that's probably the most appropriate time you've ever said that, based on the background.
I thought I'd throw it in there just because of
Nice.
what we were talking about, the long term.
It's been a little while, but it was very good timing. See you next week, folks.